Hi, I'm Tom Green. I'm a composer, and as has already been said, I wrote a chamber opera a little while ago called The World's Wife. Part of what I want to talk today is how a composer, in my case, I think I have a relatively conventional approach to composing in terms of interested in dots on the page. But I'm asking the question really, how can we as composers and musicians in dramatic contexts use technology to achieve certain dramaturgical outcomes we might not otherwise be able to do? In my case specifically, that means how do I use a looper as a dramaturgical tool? So, as Edmund just said, in 2017 I made a chamber opera for Welsh National Opera with the poet Carol Ann Duffy. Oh, that's going to happen. The World's Wife. It's a book of poems, with each poem being about the spouse of a famous character from history or myth. So you have Frau Freud, Mrs. Darwin, Queen Kong smashes. There's 31 poems, 31 characters, and from those 31 poems I chose 11 characters. And so as I put together an order of poems, you have to excuse the idiot in this image, but I spent a lot of time with those cards just kind of rearranging all the different characters. And as I thought really carefully about ordering these poems, I noticed I needed something much more than just an order to structurally respond properly to the text. I had two main ideas for this. The first was that because the piece is about how women have been systematically erased from cultural and mythical narratives, I decided to compose the whole piece using material from past female composers who I thought were unduly ignored, which is really interesting, as I had a great store then of really amazing tonal music from Barbara Strozzi or Clara Schumann, and some really amazing, much more modern material from Elizabeth Lutyens, I don't know, lots of other characters. I mean, there is literally a whole canon of incredible music over the last millennia that's completely ignored. So it was great fun for me to be able to explore that and possibly also highlight that issue at the same time. But then I also had this second idea about responding to the text properly, because I thought about how the title of the text in itself is an archetype. It's a meta character, the world's wife. It is a character, I thought, and I thought how I could make that as a musical image of that character. So I didn't have the budget or the inclination to achieve this with multiple singers. I thought it was best done with one singer. But there was a bit of a challenge there because I didn't want it to be a linear song cycle of just a succession of poems. It was at that point that looping came to mind. So I think we all know the Ed Sheeran style of loop pedal use, where you loop something and you grow block textures and everything constantly develops, usually in 8 and 13 2-bar structures. But I was more interested in using the looper to transpose chunks of time through the piece. So as the singer played different characters, I could have a duet with her past self from a loop of her singing another character previously in the piece. And as that process went on, I could increase the number of musical objects in the looper and eventually make a chorale with many characters vocally present simultaneously. I hope that that simultaneity of voices coming from one singer on stage will create the musical image of that meta character, the world's wife. All the poems of the book are at the service of making that single character. And so I wanted the music to do that as well. And as I understood it, I could only really achieve that by using technology. So let's see if I can show you some examples of what I'm talking about. No, sorry, how can I get to iTunes? Oh, here we go. Yeah, cool. So, this is Here's Why Poetry. This phrase originally appears in the first poem, Little Red Cap, and the phrase here is explaining why the character was attracted to such a horrible, wolfish man. The music here is a Barbara Strozzi quote that's been stretched out. I don't know if anybody heard, there's a little click after she said the word poetry, so I'll get back to that in a minute. So that's banked in the looper, that's really near the beginning of the piece. It's banked in the looper without being replayed. And then an hour later in the piece, that phrase recurs in the coda to Anne Hathaway, which is a poem about Shakespeare's wife. And the loop plays as the quartet uses material from a piece that Clara and Robert Schumann wrote together. So that's a kind of mirror of Van Hathaway and Shakespeare there together. So the fact that the loop material comes back, sometimes a long time afterward, means that the audience hopefully hears the piece as having a warped sense of time, and that the character that you heard an hour ago is right here now. It's very hard to kind of squash that all into a 12-minute talk, but when you're sat in the theatre, you develop the sensitivity to the pace of what might be happening, and so hopefully being able to manipulate that is really valuable resource. I think we focus a lot on technology's ability to create new sounds, but technology's ability, in this case, to generate new perceptions of time and performance is something that I find just as interesting. I also want to show one example of how the loops can make expanded instrumental textures. So in this example, you can hear how the quartet, they settle on a chord, they loop and immediately play that loop, and then they move on to another chord and repeat the process until you have a 20-note chord. And I think as I play this again, you have to attempt to imagine that you've been hearing just the fragile, kind of slim texture of a string quartet for half an hour before this moment. So the technology allowed me to make the piece a certain way that I don't think I would have been able to make otherwise. But then the practical features of the technology also inform the staging and can force certain things into the piece also. So you should be able to see in this last picture, it's hard to see, but Amanda Forbes, the soprano, she's actually holding the loop controller. It's this little mini box. I was wondering if you were holding the loop controller then. Yeah, and it was really important for me to give her, the singer, the performative agency of the loops. I mean, this whole thing is about having women erased from certain things. And so it was really important for me to give her that control rather than having them operated off stage. So we had to incorporate that object and the action of pressing it into the staging. And in that first clip I played, if you heard the click, that was the actual click of the MIDI controller, and I made sure that it had at least an audible click so the audience could slowly become aware that she was very much in control of what was happening. Even though the first 3 times she clicks it very intentionally, nothing actually happens. So you're kind of setting up a bit of a mystery that hopefully can be explained a little bit later on. in the piece. So this final example I'm going to show you is from Mrs. Icarus. And you hear this vocal phrase over a glitch ostinato. And this is one of many examples I could show you to kind of explain the final moment. Now that phrase is banked in the looper as it's sung, and this is one of the phrases that recurs a lot later in the big chorale of the piece. And then this chorale happens near the end of the penultimate poem and uses loops from many different characters that the audience has heard over the last 75 minutes. And this chorale for me is the kind of completion of the musical image of the title, and throughout the passage the soprano sings nothing live. Where's example 5 gone? See that the clock is racing. So I'll just finally say that after that, the soprano sings the final lines of the poem. She walks over to the empty quartet chairs, because they've disappeared, and turns off their loops, which I suppose metaphorically extinguishes the burden of all the past wives, but also, again, involves the technology in what's going on dramaturgically. And the piece then ends with the final poem, which is called Demeter, and that's the only poem that doesn't have any male protagonist mentioned in it, or antagonist rather. It's about motherhood, and all the loops are made there within the poem. So everything is made new. So even in that, hopefully still the dramaturgy still is being reflected in the use of the technology and enabled by the use of the technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
Yes.
Do you have any upcoming performances of that, or any recordings?
I've got a recording that I'm sure we all can familiar with the difficulties of this stuff. I mean, even just I could give a day-long presentation about how that actually eventually got on stage. But why it was only in Wales, for example, I don't, in a sense, is the quick answer. And there aren't. It might be performed at some point in the next 3 years. I don't know. I'm doing my best on that one. I have a full recording of the thing, but whether I'm allowed to share it is very ambiguous. On my website there are little clips, and I think Carol Ann Duffy herself is a friend, very keen on it, which is great, but there's some legal questions about whether I can use that in a recording, etc. Loads of other things. She's fine with it, her publishers aren't. There's lots of complexities. Yeah, it's complex. Sorry, there was one at the back there. Do talk to me afterwards, though. Sorry,
yes,
sorry
really
to interrupt.
So the loops get quite small.
Yeah.
And you're almost venturing into kind of granular synthesis or wavetable synthesis. Have you thought about going that far?
I was really interested in that idea. Yeah, I think it's hard in a 12-minute presentation. There are lots of other things that you really want to talk about. One of them is to do with economy of use, and I think that one of the big problems I definitely have, as a musician with technologies, that I tend to just get too interested in what can be done with the technology and what really should be done in here, so to speak. And so I set some rules when I was making this, that I would only allow myself loops. I wouldn't allow any other kind of vocal manipulation. There's a little bit of reverb and compression at times, but that was more of a live sound design choice. And so I'd love to also make a piece that delves into the, that absolute universe of things that you could do beyond just this strict sense of looping. But then I also felt like, at least with what I was trying to do, again, dramaturgically there, if I'd start to go granular, or if I'd start doing all sorts of other fascinating tricks, no matter how musically interesting I thought they were, I didn't feel like that would have responded to the text quite as much as I wanted. I think I tend to work best if I just sit down and I have a slightly limited box to work in that I can then kind of scrape against the walls of, rather than get lost in the abyss. I think what Sean said about hardware rather than software really resonated with me earlier.